This weekend, cool, we still have a national park system. Let's go look at Calf Island and the rest of the rocky locations in the Boston Harbor Islands National Recreational Area. Okay, Boston might be a stinky, steamy pit in the summer, but did you know there is a national park you can go visit that is accessible by the T? The aquarium stop on the Blue Line takes you right to the ferry. Yeah, okay. Tickets are $25 at full price, but if you live anywhere in Massachusetts, they top out at just $15 and $7 or less for the kiddos. You can visit the NPS page to get directed to the ferry tickets. You'll need to bring your own picnic, but you are out there on uncrowded beaches with the sea wind keeping you cool, or at least cooler. These islands have been a seasonal home to a variety of people. First the native tribes, then whalers, sailors, lighthouse keepers, and fisher folk of all sorts, including, plenty of lobstermen. Calf Island, located in the outer harbor, is not generally accessible to visitors now, as it functions partly as a wildlife sanctuary, which is kind of amazing. There's this little rocky harbor island where they are working to preserve a slice of wilderness in the midst of civilized bustle. Calf Island is located just 9 miles off the main shore. While this is a quick buzz over the water in a fast little boat, back in the age of sail, when many a boat ran aground on the plentiful rocks littering the harbor mouth, washing ashore on this island 9 miles away from civilization in winter, or just in a storm, could be just as deadly as any other deserted island. So in the 1790s, a shelter of refuge was constructed for benighted souls. Once fishing and whaling camps were established, shipwrecked victims could get shelter and help more easily. The shelter of refuge brings into clarity how far away 9 miles over water was in the age of travel that used wind, oars, and the power of your arms and back to get around. Largely overlooked or seen as a hazard to navigation, the Boston Harbor Islands are a surprise to many people as a way to run away from the city, not that far from home. So pack up your binoculars, maybe a bird book, a traveling lunch, sunscreen, and plenty of water, and escape from the present right in the middle of Boston Harbor in the Boston Harbor Islands National Recreation Area. Episode 150, Lobsters, from poor man's chicken to fancy canned good. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, I'll be looking at the start of the climb of the lobster, from pumpkin of the sea to an item of curiosity that bred innovation in the sphere of commerce. To learn how lobster managed to become increasingly expensive and scarce while just lobstering along, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that American lobster history is littered with myths. Some based on actual happenings, but others are entire fabrications or severe exaggerations that seem to have no particular basis in reality. Yet now, thanks to AI summaries, they are now with us more or less forever. Sigh. But if we get out from under the myths, the reality is much more interesting and occasionally dangerously poisonous. So first of all, were lobsters a new food to the colonists in the 1600s and 1700s, or were they familiar? Turns out, for many new arrivals in the Americas, lobsters or something like them were probably known. I mean, yes, a bunch of these people were hopeless city dwellers with limited expertise in food. But by the time they made it out to the coast of New England, or were transported there as servants of different sorts, they had encountered some sort of multi-legged hard-shell fish of the shores. Shrimp, prawns, crabs, and European side lobsters were all snagged from the briny deep. Different varieties of spiny lobsters, the distant clawless relatives of the American and European clawed lobsters, also inhabit the coastal waters of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean along the west coast of Africa. And hawking fresh seafood in carts along the streets of England was well known enough that the call of cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh, was incorporated into late 19th century sheet music and then turned into a song in a 20th century musical. So the existence of lobsters, or something like them, was not a surprise. The models for the earliest Massachusetts and Maine lobster traps were based on English items for similar purpose. And at the tippy top of the renown scale, King Henry VIII, the well-known epicure, even had lobsters listed as items at his banquets. Now those would have been the European cod lobster Homarus gammarus, or blue lobster, which is very dark in its live state, but it cooks up just as red as its cousin in the Americas. Now this arthropod was badly overfished in the same way most European seafood had been by the time the Europeans headed west to the New World. Salmon, cod, eel, oysters, etc., etc., etc. So it was available, if in a somewhat limited way. So when those early colonists arrived, lobsters with cod and oysters were familiar, even if only vaguely. But unlike the bounty of cod and oysters found in those early days, there was no obvious way to make the lobster into any sort of an industry. Thus, the American lobster, while recognized as food, fell out of favor. After all, in those colonial days, if something wasn't valuable as a commodity to be packed and shipped back to the center of that rimless wheel that was the English mercantile empire, what was the point? And so that's the reason I called lobsters the pumpkin of the sea in the introduction. Just like the large orange squashes doomed to be denigrated for their hardiness and adaptability, it was their very ubiquity that caused them to be disdained and overlooked as something of value. See episode 14 for the disambiguation of pumpkin and squash, and how pumpkins got to be associated with laziness, promiscuity, and just being trashy by being big, orange, pretty untasty, and really easy to grow. In the 17th and even early 18th century, you could truly, in the right tidal conditions on the correct beaches, simply go and pick up lobsters. But because we were really bad at cooking them, and the fact that the local tribes used them along with alewives and other seasonal fishes as agricultural fertilizer, the early infamy of the American lobster flourished. It became pig food, fertilizer, and the last choice for dinner. Those Puritans really did seem to have it out for anything that seemed easy and available. But don't worry. As with cod, chestnuts, salmon, oysters, and bison will mess up the easy bounty soon enough. And so, the early lobster myths flourished. Like any story that's been around long enough, it gets embellished. Look up lobster history on the internet, and there are a few hoary old chestnuts that are now unavoidable. The first being that household servants wrote a limit of lobster only 3 times a week into their contracts. The original of this appears to have no actual foundation in reality. The first stumbling block, of course, is simply finding a servant's contract from the 1600s or 1700s is nigh impossible. For there weren't many of any written document running around, much less a servant's contract. And of those that have been found, such a quibble over dinner was certainly not included in any of them. Now, were lobsters ill-favored as a food? Yes, it is possible to find lobster referred to as poor man's chicken in contemporary writing. I mean, at that point, chicken was a treat and lobster was, well, just lying around on the beaches. The case for lobster as food was certainly not helped by the fact that they were cooked from dead, often too long dead, and then were subjected to heat for a long time, bringing them to a rubbery texture. I found recipes that call for an hour or more of boiling or simmering. They were most likely served without butter or much of the flavoring we crave now. Remember, lemons were thin on the ground. So no, lobsters were not craveable. And any food consumed too frequently often loses its appeal, even if it is delectable at the start. So, no contracts written about them, even if it is likely that many a servant, and others as well, definitely complained about lobster again. A second myth is that prisoners were served lobster all ground up with the shells, or that prisoners rioted over too much lobster being served to them. Again, embellishment and wholesale manufacture. Prisoners were absolutely served overcooked, unseasoned lobster, just like everyone else. It was cheap, plentiful, and easily available protein. And certainly not to their liking. But ground up? Grinding things back in those days when everything was done by hand, well, that was work. Why put extra effort into the lobster being tossed to the prisoners? Further, any idea of prisoners rioting at this early stage shows an abject misunderstanding of the carceral state of colonial and early America. Except in a few military locations, there was no such thing as a jail or a prison as we think of it. And even then, there certainly was not one with the capacity capable of holding enough people for a riot. There were no dungeons or similar in which to store criminals. Prison camps of any size or duration did not particularly exist before the Civil War. Other than military prisons, all imprisonment might be in a single room and often one repurposed from other uses. Punishment was more likely to be time in stocks, or some physical action such as branding, ear or nose nicking, or corporal punishment with a whip or lash. And then the person would be simply run out of town. And, of course, in extreme circumstances, there was execution by a variety of means. So while cheap and badly cooked, the main myths surrounding punishment and suffering by lobster are just that, exaggeration and myth. Instead, lobsters in their early days were eaten with less and occasionally more relish when handled by a cook with an understanding of freshness and access to good ingredients. The clam bake methods taught to colonizers by the indigenous locals before they were killed and chased out were certainly also applied to lobsters. And honestly, a lobster steamed in kelp is delicious. But for most people, this is not the way they got lobsters. So while nutritious, fairly easy to get, and filling, the early lobster was generally regarded as being of limited value. But as fish cookery improved, as better cooks got their hands on them, and as more people with money began to accumulate in the port cities of Boston and New York, where fishing was getting harder locally, a market did start to develop. No longer could one go out and simply pick the creatures up off the tide line. Over time, they had to be spearfished in the shallows. And as markets developed and people stopped simply fishing lobsters for themselves or even their own villages and started selling them instead, new ways of catching lobsters developed. First of all, lobsters without spear marks sold for more, so netting became popular. A common way to scoop them up was a dragnet. And in this case, it was often an old wheel used as a frame that would have a net draped around it as sort of a large bucket. This contraption, pulled behind a rowboat, would allow lobsters to be scooped up off the bottom. Then, as wire became a useful manufactured product in the late 1600s, the wire trap for European crabs, crayfish, lobsters, and such were developed. Wire traps for American lobsters also appeared. However, their repair and replacement was made impractical by the mercantile barriers around wire and other metal goods put up by England and Britain on early America. And of course, the lingering tensions around the War of 1812 didn't help. So the round-top wood-lath lobster trap of Massachusetts and Maine would develop in the 1820s and 1830s. Made of wood and rope, these traps were easy to build and repair locally. Also, since they were developed by local lobstermen, they fit the habits of the local crustaceans and have been with us pretty much ever since. But if you are rowing around, hauling up and dumping these traps, especially in these days of relative plenty, how to get the lobsters to market in the best saleable shape? While barrels of oysters, fresh in cold months and pickled in others, might be fine on barges and the fledgling trains that were starting to creep out around the developing New England and new, soon to be old, Northwest, lobsters didn't do so well out of water and didn't take to pickling. Enter the smackmen. A smack is a sort of low-lying, wide-sterned sailboat that has long been used for fishing. With lobstering moving to boats, a way to corral the lobsters was devised. Make a well at the bottom of the boat that allows seawater to flow freely through it. And this is where you toss the cantankerous clawed beasties. Thus, the well smack or lobster smack was born, and now lobsters caught away from the bustling ports could be brought in alive in their seawater swimming pools. And as a result, fresh, even live lobsters could be cooked and start to be enjoyed, but still only near the shores, until the can arrived. As you recall from episodes 117, 118, and 119, the beginning bottle and canning preservation of food was a bit rocky. People knew that spoilage happened, and it could be held at bay by the canning process. But since people still didn't yet understand how spoilage exactly worked, they were also unclear on exactly how to stop it. As a result, lots of guesswork. But the lack of scientific understanding was not going to stop them from trying. And so, with imperfect understanding of the principles, the emerging lobster industry went for the early 19th century version of move fast and break things. As you certainly remember, in the early days, canned goods were fancy. Maybe I should say tinned goods to give them their recognizable fancy designation. And lobster, as it was emerging from its early days of being the ubiquitous poor man's chicken of coastal dwellers to something a bit harder to acquire, maybe it did have a future in this emerging world of luxury tinned goods. And so a home canning or tinning industry of lobster was born. Canning factories would emerge after the Civil War, but in these early days of freedom and botulism, lobstermen would bring their catches home. Their wives, with the help of their children, would cook and remove lobster meat from the shells, tails and claws only. The rest was too much work. And then they would shove the resulting chunks into cans. Lids would be soldered on with a small hole remaining. The cans would be boiled, a final bit of brine would be added, the can would be sealed up, and cases of cans would be supplied to distributors. Which led to a new adage for lobsters: green in the sea, red in the pot, black in the can. In other words, the spoilage rate for canned lobster was high. Any consumer worth their salt knew that a swollen can was bad news, but painful gastric distress and occasional death could lurk even in unswollen cans. All the same, tinned goods were still a show of luxury, and so people continued to roll the dice on tinned lobster, as well as clams and a few other seafood delicacies that were gaining currency as fancy food for fine people. And so we start to have recipes for both fresh and canned lobster in the cookbooks of the early 19th century. Not in any cookbooks containing the adjectives frugal or economical. Lobster, both fresh and canned, was, after all, just the sort of frivolous and possibly dangerous sort of food the vegetable diet adherents were warning against. But if you were more of the freewheeling sort, neither frugal nor economical, who craved a little adventure, how might lobster appear on your table in the 1840s? A lobster soup with a milk broth thickened with flour and or cornstarch. For the modern diner, this would bring to mind a thin chowder or possibly a disappointing bisque, as none of the tamale or internal fat would be used. You might also find baked lobster, made with canned lobster, as a possibility. Made into a sort of loaf with curry powder, hard-boiled egg yolks, flour, and milk, might grace a cold luncheon. Please note that canned salmon of either Kennebec or California provenance would also be acceptable. Fresh lobster might be boiled, removed from the shell, chopped fine, flavored with Worcestershire sauce, butter, parsley, and onion, then shaped into chops, battered and fried, and served with sauce. A lobster fricassee was also recommended. The lobster should be parboiled, 10 minutes per pound, and in the days of 4 to 6 pound lobsters, well, that could be a long boil. Then the meat and the coral, what is also known as tamale or the internal fat, would also be combined with the lobster meat cut into small pieces. Then, with some cream and a bit of salt and pepper and cayenne, the mixture would be gently stewed for as long as the lobster boiled at the beginning. So even the smallest 2 and 3 pound lobsters would face an hour or so of cooking. See, we have yet to abandon overcooking lobsters. Lobster balls, made in much the same way as crab cakes with lots of breadcrumbs or cracker crumbs, were also offered. However, curry powder continued to be a favored seasoning. And of course, Adding lobster meat to a hollandaise sauce as a dressing for fish dishes was also popular. This need to dress up, embellish, coat, and overcook lobster was in keeping with the cooking methods of the age. A plain dish of just high-quality ingredients would have been shocking. Evidence that you were, well, plain yourself. Lobster at this stage is stuck in the trap of what might taste good versus what appears good. But it was becoming clear that freshly killed and cooked lobster was the best. And hey, there were surely some poorly or undocumented lobster preparations that were good out there, but disappeared for their utter simplicity. I mean, so simple, who needs to write that down? So the innovation around lobster preparation, preservation, and transport would continue, even if it kept getting wrapped up in ever-evolving attitudes of what was fancy or important. Lobster continued as a poverty food where it was caught, but it begins to gain a name as tasty and possibly fancy as we move away from the coast. And as a weird and even mysterious-looking thing would continue to attract myths of all manner. And as a last unsolicited plug, if you're interested in lots of cool and generally strange scientific lobster facts, dig up the Gastropod episode on lobsters from 2020. Honestly, if you were to tell me they were space aliens, I might consider your opinion. Anyway, next episode starts with an entirely new topic for us. Hope it's not too strange. Have you ever heard of China? Because most people in the early 19th century United States had just barely heard of it. Despite tea and the Clippers and such, for many Americans, China was as real and as accessible as the surface of the moon. Meanwhile, in war-torn China, especially in and around the Greater Pearl River Delta, the vague descriptions of the Golden Mountain, or Gamsan, looked like a better alternative for many peasant men than service as cannon fodder in an apparently endless and confusing series of wars. As the gold fields and then the preparation for a rail line to cross the American Rocky Mountains, China and America are about to set up for the first of many political clashes. To see how that all got started and how otters are involved, tune in next time to find out about the first arrivals of Chinese food in America. Hint, it was largely the roots of what we call Cantonese food today, and I promise to explain more. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes lets me know that you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know that you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least find it interesting. And even though it can take me a while to answer you, don't worry, I do read and think about the interesting stuff you send me. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food. And all this information is available in the show description.